Sustaining Creativity podcast. I'm your host, Mari Riesberg. Over the past several years, I've combined my degrees in acting and somatic psychology to share my sustaining creativity techniques with performers. And now I've decided to share it with a bigger audience that includes you. I believe we are all creative, and this podcast is all about that. I'll be interviewing people from all backgrounds, ages, and creativity experiences to share just how creative we all are. Today, I'll be chatting with Beret Strong and John Tweedy. Beret is a writer, director, producer, and owner of Landlocked Films. John is a filmmaker, writer, and mediator. Please enjoy Beret Strong and John Tweedy. Welcome to the Sustaining Creativity podcast. Today, I have two very special guests. I'm here with Beret Strong, director, producer, writer, educator, owner of Landlocked Films, and John Tweedy, who's a filmmaker, writer, and mediator. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I am super excited to have both of you here and get kind of the double experience of director, writer, producers, editors, all the filmmaking adventures that you are both on. And yeah, before we kind of dive into the nitty-gritty creativity, why don't you take a couple of minutes and let our listeners know a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've been doing that since the 1990s. So I feel like an old timer in terms of like the changing technology and just, the changing field of documentary filmmaking. But it was an accidental thing. I didn't get trained to do it. I was a academic and writer, and then life happened, and as an opportunities came along, and I had some really big curiosity about visual storytelling and narrative and things like that. And so we wandered into filmmaking kind of accidentally, and that's been a great joy.
Nice. I love all of that. I love kind of the falling into career and the visual storytelling. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But how about you, John?
So I would, in general, just consider myself a storyteller in various forms. Beret and I started making films, as she said, in the 90s. Before that, I was focused, my official creativity, if you will, was focused on writing fiction. I wrote a novel back in the day, and short stories and poems and that kind of thing. And right along, I've also been a lawyer, and now I'm a mediator. And to me, all of those are forms of storytelling. That you are trying to communicate, you're trying to persuade, you're trying to make sense of life through a narrative, and that can happen in various ways. And I enjoy pursuing it in all of them.
That's so fantastic. You are not the first lawyer that I've had on to talk about things creativity. So I'm curious to kind of hear your take on that as well. But I love the storytelling theme that both of you have and how it shows up. I'm super curious, what does it mean to you to be creative?
That's such an interesting question, because I feel like I'm so immersed in creative practice, I don't really think about creativity as a separate thing. But if I do think about it as an entity, it's this business of how do you bring together your unconscious and conscious minds and your toolkit to create something new that you want to express. And I used to be a poet. I actually did an M.F.A. in poetry. And one thing I loved about poetry writing was that it comes from your unconscious. You just can't plan a poem. You might have an idea, but actually stuff comes out of you that you don't even know is going to come out. Now, I'd say filmmaking is a little bit more intentional, because what you're doing in documentary is you're gathering materials and you're fashioning a story somewhat painstakingly and making decisions about what to include and how do these pieces go together. And there's the visual and the auditory and the actual narrative arc, and that has a different life. But so we have different practices creatively, which I think is kind of great. And then we do it together, which is also really great.
Nice. And how about for you, John? What does it mean to you to be creative?
Well, I think of it as the sort of interplay between structure and variation, in the sense that all disciplines, whether for me it's law, writing, filmmaking, have structures that are imposed on them. You have to obey certain laws of, you know, narrative construction. If you're making a film, it has to make sense to a viewer. It has to have a plot that somebody's going to follow. There are rules for storytelling in fiction. There's rules, plenty of rules for storytelling in law and court. But then there are the variations, and how do you infuse that structure with your own heart and look for the ways in which you can make those structures bend to your will and speak out into an audience in a new way.
Nice. I mean, what was it like to hear each other's version of creativity?
I'm always interested in what he's going to say, because we do this stuff together like all day long practically, and yet we're very different, and his mind is different, and so he'll and he relates to history, I mean, I'm always like, oh wow, you said that, and often I find him quite eloquent. I'm like, wish I'd said that. But yeah, we're different in the way we think too. I think that John's a fairly not altogether linear. He's a very lyrical writer, but he's a historically oriented thinker, and he reads stuff I won't read. I tend to think analogically. Like I liked my academic background is comparative literature, and the interesting thing about that is people are like, oh, you compare books from different cultures, and I'm like, yeah, you do kind of do that, but really what you do is you think analogically, and you often take things that really are different cultures, but just different in deeper ways, and you somehow find some connection, and then you exploit it. Like the first academic paper I ever wrote was called Freud, Foucault, and French Feminism. And it was like looking at how do you take, the way they characterized women back in the 19th century and said our uteruses made us hysterical, and it was really about hysteria. How do you connect that to all this other stuff and weave it together in some sort of interesting, in this case, academic way? And that's my kind of deal.
I love it.
Well, and so I am a linear thinker, and I am always amazed by Beret's ability to multitask, multi-think. She's always on 4 or 5 tracks at once, in terms of what she's doing, what she's thinking. She's fascinated by various topics. She's fascinated by medicine, for example, and is writing a book on medical experimentation. She's fascinated by issues of race and society. She's fascinated by issues of equity, and all of it's happening at once. And so her mind is going lots of different places all the time. And I just stand back kind of in awe of all of that and go, where are you now?
Yeah, I mean, what a great duo to have strengths in different areas, and talking about the poetry and the subconscious and the law and the boundaries that you have to work within for a legal court presentation are very different than writing a poem. So yeah, I love hearing all of these different pieces and how they show up and work together and really support each other.
Yeah, but it's all working on the human heart. It's all, if it doesn't land with somebody's emotions, it doesn't land.
Right.
And if it's not a gift, it doesn't land. I think a lot of times people are focused in their creativity on themselves and their their mind and what's interesting to them. And certainly I do that too. But I've learned over time that if something isn't a gift to an audience, if it isn't directed outward to the world, to what other people are thinking or how other people, uh, connect with the world, then it's creativity for sure. It's self-expression, but it doesn't find an audience. It lets
Yeah,
it knows how to look for an audience.
that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think there's different types of creativity that some are to be expressed outwardly and to share, and then there are the more personal, private expressions of creativity that you might only do for yourself to keep your creative cup full. And it sounds like, yeah, there's room for all of it in the things that you do, and one aspect may drive a certain project more than another. So I think it's fantastic, and I think the world is lucky to have people like you in it to bring gifts of creativity to other people. So thank you for doing the things that you do.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting seeing what people do creatively. Like if you just on Facebook, you see like their creative cooking, you see their creative photographs, you see people write stuff and they post it. It's like there's so much impulse toward sharing, even if it's interpersonal. We're kind of public artists in part, which is different from, although we're also private because we do have our own private stuff we like to do too. I consider letter writing a great creative activity. If you have like a conversation with somebody that's meaningful, and how do you express yourself in writing, and connect emotionally with somebody you care about? Like, to me, that's one of my favorite creative practices of all. But you just see it all around, that people are engaged, and wanting to be in conversation with each other about it.
Yeah, I love the letter writing because cognitively, when you put pen to paper, more creativity is activated in your brain than if you're typing on a computer, typing on a keyboard. So flex that creativity and write those letters.
For sure. And back in the day, they used to publish the letters of so and so and the letters of so and so. I haven't seen a book titled "The Emails of blah blah" or the
Not yet.
texts or the tweets of so and so. I mean,
The tweets,
but
I feel like there's
maybe
probably some books out there that have
probably.
something. Well, since both of you navigate lots of creative expression and creative experiences, I imagine you come up against challenges. What are some of the more creative challenges that you faced, and then how did you navigate them?
You want to start, Bear?
No, you go first.
Okay. I was thinking about this question since you asked it, and one of the challenges that I face as a video editor, and as a storyteller in general, but take the example of video editing, is structure. How do you structure a story? Because you have all sorts of pieces and parts and ideas, and this happened and that happened and the other thing happened. And there are lots of choices about that. And the linear storytelling from beginning to end is often just not the most appealing choice. You can weave together various stories, and you can back and forth in various ways. There are various famous, works of literature that start at the end and go to the beginning, and that kind of thing. You know, Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, for example. And so the way that when we were doing our most recent film, This Is Not Who We Are, which is about the experience of Black people in Boulder, we had a very compelling current story about a man who was being harassed by police officers outside of his dorm while he was just trying to pick up garbage as part of his work study job. And we had this video footage from body cams of that. And then we wanted to tell a story about the history of Boulder going back to 1870. Then we wanted to tell another story about current experiences of students and adults in Boulder as they navigate their lives. And so there's three different kinds of stories. And then we wanted to tell a story about how city council is dealing with these kinds of issues on a public space. So putting all that together and cutting back and forth and holding viewer interest is a huge challenge for us as a team, but me in particular as an editor. So what I did was I took each chunk of the story, each scene, each piece of it, and I put it on a post-it. And then I color coded what type of scene it was. And then I put all the post-its up on a door in our editing studio. And then with that, you're able to move them around, categorize them and move them around and figure out a flow. And it's a little bit like, you see these crime dramas or whatever, and the person's got all the index cards and, push pins and
Attached to it.
all that. It's a little bit like that. And then organizing them. And it was a very helpful way to kind of visualize structure and to kind of put things together. Once you have all the pieces, then how do you fit them together? And that was a big challenge, and it was a fun and actually very helpful way for that.
Yeah, and it sounds really creative too. Post-it notes. I don't know. It's kind of fun to move things around. And does this go here? But it reminds me of writing stories too, and how you can do
Well,
that.
and it accesses a different part of the brain because you think about writing a story, but then you think about if you encapsulate the scene of that story onto a piece of paper, and then you move it around, and then it becomes a shape, and you can see the shape of your plot arc when you represent it visually. And so then you're working various aspects of your brain to kind of work on the problem.
Nice. How about for you, Barrett? What are some of the creative challenges that you have been navigating, and how do you navigate them?
This is interesting listening to John, because I'm like, yeah, there's all this iterativeness that you're like, there's a lot of revision and stuff. But well, actually, I'll just, first thought, best thought, at the risk of sounding like a complainer, what came into my head was about the challenge of working in a group on a creative project. I find that documentary filmmaking is a team sport. You not only have your film subjects, right? And they don't necessarily get editorial control, but you're working with whatever they are sharing that they're brave enough or willing to share. Then there's the footage and whatever you capture. But when you're in a team of multiple filmmakers, you have to figure out, well, how are we going to negotiate and navigate making decisions together? And what happens when somebody wants something that somebody else doesn't want? And how do you make those decisions? How do you share power? If you have too many cooks in the kitchen and you're making a film, you water it down to where it's actually mediocre. It actually, at a certain point, it doesn't work well. So you shouldn't have like a big committee making a film. You should have, some focused people, but then you have to really listen to one another. And then you have to, sometimes you have to sort of bargain a little bit, sometimes you have to fight a little bit. So there's that whole process, and it's both rewarding and difficult.
Yeah, it does. It sounds both ends of the pendulum can have reward, but can be very challenging and rewarding at the same time. So yeah, I mean, working on a team, definitely so many creative visions, and having, I think it's important that everyone be able to speak it and then come to some decision of what's going to be the most effective for the project that you all are working on. It sounds like you all have navigated that successfully within the projects that you've worked on. So yeah,
but it is challenging in the sense that especially a group creative project will push you past your understanding of yourself and the material and your own ideas of it and your own first creative thought. And that requires conflict and requires you to get beyond ego, and it requires you to get beyond your thought about how it should work and into a space where no one knows. and you're figuring it out, and you're actually listening to each other on a new level. And often that kind of breakthrough is preceded by some stress or conflict or misunderstanding or whatever, when finally people really get down to it,
Mhm.
and they get to a new level, and you have that requires some bravery too.
Yeah, and there's so much courage to show up in conflict, and I think that takes a lot of creativity, conflict and showing up and speaking your truth, and there's more creativity that goes into that than I think we recognize. And because I think in our society, our face-to-face sharing opinions is not how we function. If we can be behind a screen or a keyboard, it's a little bit easier, a little bit different. But when you're in the same room, having that conflict can be a little more challenging and a little more real. So, yeah, I just really appreciate all of the pieces that you've brought up.
I mean, there's no room for being offended,
Yeah.
right? But just,
There
you
may
know,
not be room, but I'm sure that people do
well,
get it.
you feel it, but
Yeah.
it's a step on the process, right? Okay, I'm offended by that. All right, now what?
Yeah.
Um, then where do we get beyond and below and through that? What's on the other side of being offended?
Mhm.
Well,
Um,
and we could add that one of our creative practices is to ask the community for input. We didn't always do this in our early years of filmmaking, but now we do with like rough cut screenings. We actually ask for community, input, or we ask people we know and trust to like look at the work in progress and share their, and it becomes this co-creation, because then a prospective audience is actually saying, oh, this landed this way for me, or I was offended by that, because frankly, especially if you do a film about race, you can have that happen. So it's kind of wonderful to expand the creative practice to include a wider circle than maybe is traditionally done in certain kinds of art forms.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it's wonderful, and it offers such a new perspective on how to hear voices that may not be heard in different creative opportunities as well. So I'm going to take a very quick step to the left, and I want to hear what your earliest memory of being creative is.
Well, I gave this a little bit of thought, and I had two ideas. When I was like, no, I'm not going to talk about that, even though it had to do with my epistolary self, which started so young. I mean, the minute I could write, they had me doing these letters. But what came to my mind was that when I was a child, I spent my childhood summers in a log cabin in the Rockies, that my grandparents had built in around 1930. And this is a log cabin we still have in the family. It has no running water, no electricity, and it's little. Anyway, I spent my childhood summers there, and we had to make our own fun. And that meant going out into the forest and using pine cones and rocks and sticks and stuff to create whole worlds. You're creating a fairy world, you're creating a chase game, you're building a fake mini log cabin, you're creating an imaginary life of a child excitement with just found materials out in nature. And we just did it. We also went to the public library and got a lot of books once a week, but that's what we did to keep ourselves entertained. And we got really good at it. And I think children need those kinds of environments. And I'm really grateful that I got to have that.
Do you feel like you still have that, like, make believe or pretend light within you as an adult?
Not in the same way, although I do like to go out and like look at nature and go, well, look at the shape of that piece of wood, or look at that rock, or that plant, or so I think I like to look and imagine, but I don't play in the same way, or I play with other sorts of materials, you could say. But I think it just helped free my mind to interacting with environment and seeing what can you do with it. And then you have kids, right? Because we raise kids and they're so about it, you know, and you realize, oh, that's what they need is they need a palette, they need a beach, they need a backyard, they need whatever. And I think sometimes kids spend too much time indoors, and if they were out making their world outdoors, that would be really great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about for you, John? What's your earliest memory of being creative?
So my earliest memory, I think, this is in a house that we moved out of when I was 3. So I have a memory of, and it must have been finger paints, but I remember taking paint and smearing it all over the wall of and just really loving that and like creating, and then being in trouble, right? For doing that. And so there was this sense of creativity and transgression that were sort of embedded at the same time. And you know, I don't want to read too much into that, but there's a creativity and transgression are often kind of paired experiences, right? And certainly in the work that we've done, we've at different points tried to engage in creative work that causes discomfort or causes people to look at things that are, you know, a little bit transgressive or whatever. We're not experimental or transgressive artists in the ways that many people are, but that was my earliest memory.
I love it. I love hearing the early memories of creativity and how they still show up in adult life or don't show up in adult life, and how you have incorporated aspects of those early memories into the things that you do today. I'm curious, when you think about kind of childhood creativity transforming into adult creativity, what are your kind of similar adult creative experience or expressions that you engage in?
This is interesting in terms of like what one becomes, you know, because I think I was starting on my path totally in elementary school. I mean, really young. I remember asking for a camera, like a really cheap little camera, for my 6th grade graduation present. I didn't quite ask. I sort of demanded it, like, I'll take this for my present. My dad was like, whoa, 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 you don't demand presents, you ask and maybe you get. But I got my first little camera, a little Instamatic, when I was, you know, graduating from 6th grade. And the still photography, looking at the world by framing it and taking pictures, was something I fell in love with at a young age. And the still photography was something I still loved, and I think led me to filmmaking, because it was an extension. It was a different form. And then I started as a writer as a kid. I mean, really as a, not necessarily a creative writer, well, a little of that, but just as an expressive writer. And when they asked us in like 6th grade what we wanted to be when we grew up, I said, I want to get a PhD in reading. And I said it because my dad was a professor. And so that was the only thought I had, was like, well, just gonna be like him. But reading was my favorite thing. And so, you know, I was like, well, I can do that. And then the irony is that's kind of what I did do. You know.
It. Like, that's amazing. I think I love, though, the kid brain of, I want to get a PhD in reading and do that, and how it made total sense. Like, yeah, why not? Why not get a PhD in reading? Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Do you have anything to add, John, for your kind of
I think that
experience? And
I think our creativity gets siloed. It gets into, I mean, I think our minds get siloed in general. People start to, you know, label themselves or be labeled or be encouraged to be labeled. And, you know, you hear these podcasts, do one thing and do it well. Well, I messed that one up. But you know, as a kid, I was interested in pictures. I was interested in music. I was interested in words. I was a very wordy kid. And in high school, I sort of figured out how to pull it together in some ways doing technical theater. I was helping like plays. You had this sort of, you'd have look down at the the stage space, the proscenium, and lighting it. You're sort of painting with light, and I was very fascinated with that. And but then I sort of let that go in college, and then coming back, and when desktop video editing became a phenomenon, and we were first working with a really experienced master editor in who came and edited our first couple documentaries. I was looking over his shoulder and going, "What is that?" And you know, because we didn't go to film school. I went to law school and did a master's in social science and blah blah blah. But just as soon as I was exposed to that, I just, you know, was magnetized to it because it combines music and image and words and story, and all of that kind of intersects, and it just blew my mind, and I was been captivated ever since. It's so multidisciplinary, and I think that people, you know, often have lots of different sides to their creativity, that, you know, they feel like they're getting, you know, put into false choices. I have to do this or that, and
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah, I really like appreciate the, you know, what you were just saying about people that I could either do this or that, I can't do both, or the version of creativity that they do isn't okay in a family scenario, or, you know, someone wants to be a fashion designer and their family says, well, what's your backup plan? You know, that whole experience. I imagine both of you have encountered maybe people in your own lives or other people who don't think they are creative, or creativity isn't something that's important. How would you encourage others to find creativity in their lives?
well, I think a lot of people have it, but don't feel permission to have it, or think they need permission to have it. And permission can take various forms. It can say, well, I want to be some, I can't be creative unless I have the opportunity to be X. And being X means, well, I have to go to school for it, or I have to get a grant so that I can do it, or I have to get a job that will allow me to do it, or I have to, the world has to give me something that will allow me to be creative. And you can stand around a long time waiting for all that.
Yeah.
Uh, and even then, it won't necessarily help. I mean, just about every, you know, artist that one can think of as a day job of some sort. Um, Even if it's a day job in that art form, you know, there's the art that they want to create, and then there's the art that they have to create because they have to serve some master or some patron or whatever in order to pay the bills or keep the wheels, you know, spinning, and they're doing what they're interested in their off hours. That's true of everybody. So the idea that you won't have to do the thing you're passionate about in your off hours is kind of a myth. Um, you know, for me, I practice law, and I still am a actually mediator. Have a full-time job doing that, and then nights and weekends. You know, when the kids were little, I'd put the kids to bed from 9 p.m. until midnight. I'd edit video, and you know, and I think, you know, Sylvia Plath wrote poems from 2 to 4 in the morning, while her kids were asleep. Well, you know, Wallace Stevens was an insurance salesman. Um, you know, I mean, it's you've gotta just do it. It's just, you know, I'm sorry I even said that, but you can't wait for permission, and you
Yeah.
can't wait for life to align.
Yeah. But it's okay to have a day job and have your creative pursuits. They don't have to be one and the same. It's you're still allowed to be creative if you have the 9 to 5 job.
I think we're
Yeah,
awfully audience driven. I think in our culture, people, it was so interesting because when John wrote his novel, we were living in Argentina, we were living in Buenos Aires, and he writes this novel all year while we're down there. And then when we came back, people asked about it because he was like, what did you do for your year? Because I was doing something else that year. And what bothered me was, instead of saying, hey, what's it about? Why'd you do it? What's your deal? Their thing was like, do you have a publisher? As if you're not legitimately allowed to do it unless you're gonna, like, be successful. And to me, that's super discouraging. Like, we shouldn't. It is wonderful to have an audience if you want one. And with films, we do want an audience. But I think the way our culture treats achievement is disheartening, because the messaging that people get is it has to be quote unquote good, and it has to have success in some sets of parameters. Who makes those up? And I think it discourages the innate creativity that we're all carrying around all the time, and it can be sort of squelched out of people. And I like it when people feel like, not only am I going to be creative, but watch this, I'm going to be as wild as I actually am. I'm going to be so wild that you think about James Joyce, or you think about, maybe Emily Dickinson, they're like, sometimes people have creative practice that the society and time they live in can't even deal with. That's like, oh, that's porn, instead of that's an incredible novel, because of their moment of reception. But it's like, did that stop them? Oh no, it didn't stop them. And that's really one of the questions is like, what inspires you? I'm like, what inspires me is people who just, there are just no limits, right? They just do whatever they want to do, and they will sort it out, or history will sort it out, or they'll go into oblivion. I have this feeling that a zillion creative women in past centuries never had audiences, and they created nonetheless. I just know they did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's such a great reminder that create, whether you have an audience or not, still create. Creativity is that important to your soul, to your life, to your joy, to your happiness, that if it brings you joy, it doesn't need an audience for recognition or validation, that just creating it can be enough. So thanks for that reminder. I think we all need to hear that sometimes.
Well, the word that you just used a couple times that is really key for me is joy.
Yeah.
And if if you dial in to the source of joy in what you do, whatever it is, but in your creative life, then you won't have writer's block. You won't have all of those things are, the sort of blockage of or disconnection of oneself from, the sort of creative joy that is it's where you need to be. And sometimes it's that, oh my gosh, this isn't good enough, or all that societal expectation, and I can't because, but staying close to the joy is probably the most important thing.
I love that. Staying close to the joy. Quote, well, cross stitch it on a pillow or something. Staying close to joy is great. It's been such a treat to chat with both of you. I have one last question. What does it feel like in your body to be creative?
I would say it's like my favorite thing. Well, I mean, there's other favorite things, but when we're in the creative flow, whether it's film or writing, I feel a sense of deep well-being. I feel integrated as a human. I feel like my truest self is getting some expression, and then you create something that you actually find beautiful, or sometimes you hear back somebody else finds it beautiful. It's so satisfying because it's a conversation you're having often with some other soul, and there's a connecting understanding, and sometimes there's no words for it. You can just feel it, right? And I'm fed by that.
I love it. How about for you, John? What does it feel like in your body to be creative?
For me, it's this creative surprise. It's this eureka. It's like you're putting together, moving pieces of something around and around and around in your mind, or your hands, or your keyboard, or whatever. And then all of a sudden something happens that you didn't intend, or maybe you try to intend it and it came out right, but usually it's not quite what you're trying to do. Something drops into place, unbidden somehow. And you just step back and go, well, look at that. And it's just this kind of beautiful explosion of pleasure that that's so cool. Look at that. And I actually that's more fun for me than getting into a film festival or having whatever accolade a piece of art receives. It's that moment of kind of initial discovery that is really the most exciting.
I would second that we've been doing this for so long. I think John and I agree that the greatest joy of all is in the act of creation. Everything that comes afterwards, where you're interacting with audience or doing screens, whatever, it's uplifting, it's affirming, it's exciting to have that dialogue. It's not as thrilling as the actual act of creating, and which is why they call it postpartum blues when you finish a film and you're sad that you're done, because you're relieved that you're done, but you're sad because that particular activity is over.
Yeah, it's so true. Happens in all art forms as well. But thank you both for taking the time to chat with me. If people want to learn more about the work that you do, films, where can they find that, and where can they get in touch with you?
Well, I mean, currently, the thing that we would encourage people to do is to support our current film project. The film's called This Is Not Who We Are. We have a website, This Is Not Who We Are Film.com. It's going to be on PBS, Rocky Mountain PBS on April 20th. And then it'll be released to PBS nationwide in June. And there'll be streaming opportunities on various PBS affiliates. If you don't catch the broadcast, you'll be able to stream it through PBS. After that, there's a lot of ways for people to use the film, connect with the material, think about the material in their own communities. The film is about Boulder, Colorado, but really it is about analog communities and how we relate to these issues in communities across the country. So we really would invite people to connect with that if they are so moved.
And that website has like a messaging function. So if anybody wrote, "Dear Beret, dear John, I want to talk to you about blah, blah, blah," we'll get the message, and I always write back, so I'm happy to be in dialogue with people who are like, I have something to say, or, because that's the fun. I love to connect with other people who have, some sort of thing going on where they want to have a conversation.
Perfect. Well, I will put that website in show notes so people have easy access to finding it. And thank you again so much for taking the time to chat with me. It's been a pure pleasure.
You're a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, this is delightful. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Sustaining Creativity Podcast. We'd love to keep in touch, so follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We are at Sustaining Creativity. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Tag your friends and family so they can listen too. We love to hear from you, so leave your reviews, comments, and questions. Check out our website, sustainingcreativity.com, for upcoming offerings and creativity coaching. Tune in Tuesdays for our next episode. And remember, with creativity, anything's possible.